Well, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. I'm Professor Larry Jacobs. I direct the Center for the Study of Politics and Governance, the University of Minnesota's Humphrey School of Public Affairs. Before we begin, I want to just invite you to participate during today's event. As you can see on this slide at the bottom, there is a button, the Q&A button, and we encourage you to use it, give us questions. We have a bias towards questions that go in different directions, challenge maybe some of our assumptions. That's really a very powerful part of this conversation. I want to welcome you and thank you for joining us for today's program, Bipartisanship in Congress Still Matters, a conversation with Francis Lee. I'm delighted to welcome Professor Lee, who is the professor of politics and public affairs at Princeton University. Her research focuses on congressional politics, national policymaking, party politics, and representation. She has authored or co-authored 4 books, including her most recent publication with James Curry, The Limits of Party, Congress and Lawmaking in a Polarized Era, which we're going to focus on today. Welcome, Professor Lee. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here.
One of the things that I really enjoyed reading in your books is you learn a lot. You learn a lot about actually what's going on. And so I want to start just by doing a couple snapshots of what's going on in Congress and give everybody an opportunity to kind of get closer to what's happening in Congress and maybe not rely so much on the media's portrayal, which can be misleading, as well as some of the statements by leadership in Congress. So let's start with 2017. This was a big year, of course. Donald Trump was elected. Republicans had majorities in the US House and Senate. Paul Ryan comes in, who had been in Washington his entire career. He was thrilled about the opportunity, as he saw it, to enact his blueprint. It was known as the Better Way. He described it as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity that most of us only dream about. What was Speaker Ryan talking about, and how did things work out for him?
Well, Speaker Ryan was talking about the plan that a set of task forces, Republican task forces in the House had put together for what they would do on a wide range of policy fronts if given the opportunity. The opportunity meaning if they won unified control of government in the 2016 elections, which to their surprise, to everyone's surprise, they did. And so, this was a time of great euphoria for Republicans. They had a plan. They had hashed out a lot of the issues, and they thought they would be able to march in lockstep to do, to do all this, to transform American policy. But what they discovered quickly was that it's much easier to get members of Congress to agree on a document than to or on a message, that prepared for an election campaign, than to agree on the details of public policy. They kicked off their legislative drive of with their top priority to repeal and replace Obamacare. Devoted 9 months to the effort. A series of embarrassing defeats for the party. This was the issue on which they had campaigned most prominently, going back to the passage of Obamacare in 2010. They had taken dozens of votes to repeal Obamacare, including they had passed a repeal bill in 2015 while Obama was still president. So they thought they would be able to just execute on that plan. They had used reconciliation, the process that allows the majority party to avoid a filibuster in the Senate. And they had passed it. Obama had vetoed it. They were ready to do it again. But internal fractures in the party over lots of different issues. The insurance regulations in Obamacare, which were popular, what to do about those. The fact that many states, including many states represented by Republican senators, had already expanded Medicaid, what to do about those funding streams, what to do about the fact that a lot of people were getting subsidies for health insurance under Obamacare. How were all those issues going to be addressed? And they couldn't reach agreement. They eventually got a bill out of the House of Representatives, barely, but they got members to vote for it on the basis that it would be reworked in the Senate. And so let's kick the process along. But in the Senate, it was, despite lengthy negotiations, the party could not coalesce around a plan. And eventually the whole effort went down to defeat. So it was a real lesson in how difficult it is for a majority party, even in our polarized era, to do grand things with no cross-party support. In fact, that it very rarely happens, which is one of the things that Jim and I discuss in the book, that there's little policy making today, even under polarized conditions, that rests only on the support of one party.
So I just want to give a shout out to folks. We're going to use terms, and I just want to be clear about it. Unified government just means that one party controls the White House, the U.S. House of Representatives, and the U.S. Congress. By contrast, divided government means that there are different parties controlling one of those three. And so it makes it even harder. As you know well, Speaker Ryan had been a strong advocate for a fairly massive reduction in government. He wanted to see a very substantial cut in spending. He wanted to see financial regulations that have been passed during the financial crisis in 2010. He wanted to see those repealed entirely. He wanted to see limits on coverage for abortion. He wanted work requirements imposed on food stamps and on down the line. And correct me if I'm wrong, I think he struck out on every single one of those things.
Struck out on all those things. That's right. Yes. All those were part of the plan, the better way. But all of them were impossible, and they were impossible not due to Democrats' filibuster in the Senate. They were due to the fact that the Republican Party couldn't agree among themselves on those issues.
I just want to mention, if you go back in time, you can look this up on the media and Google. If you go to January 2017 through the spring, there was all sorts of happy talk among Republicans, including Paul Ryan, who was giving victorious speeches about what they were going to do. So there was tremendous hope, elation about what was about to happen. That, as Professor Lee just said, didn't. Let's jump ahead to 2020. It's very different circumstances. The Democrats are now have a majority under Nancy Pelosi in the U.S. House. You've got President Trump in the White House. You've got Republicans in the Senate, and COVID strikes. In the beginning of the year, the country was panicked, and bill was passed in the spring, or bills were passed in the spring, and then things just went quiet, and there was lots of turmoil and controversy about the need for more action, and it just didn't happen for many months. Walk us through 2020 and why that's different from what happened in 2017 with Paul Ryan's, elated condition.
Well, it's difficult to imagine political circumstances that were less hospitable to a strong government response to the COVID crisis. And we had just finished with a highly divisive presidential impeachment where the president had been acquitted. It is purely all on party lines. You have the House controlled by Democrats, the Senate controlled by Republicans, and it's a presidential election year. These are not circumstances that would promote, you would expect, bipartisan cooperation. And yet, in March 2020, in the teeth of the crisis, he passed the CARES Act. Immense government response to its $2.2 trillion legislation that provided assistance across the U.S. economy, from workers to small businesses to hospitals. 10% of GDP, basically, in the CARES Act. It's unprecedented piece of legislation. And they did it in an entirely bipartisan manner without opposition. This was, of course, this was difficult. The negotiations, especially over pandemic unemployment aid between McConnell and Schumer, but they eventually got a deal. And we shouldn't underestimate how important it was. I mean, it sustained U.S. incomes in the face of a rise in unemployment, more than 30 million people losing their jobs. So it was a robust response and made the difference for millions of Americans. As that money ran out at the end of the summer, then there was a question about to what extent it would be renewed, and there was hard bargaining between the Trump administration and Pelosi. And I think some worry on the part of Democrats that striking a major deal right before a presidential election might help Trump get reelected. So I think there were some mixed feelings there. But then the election. Then the election occurred, and in the post-election period, they came together with a significant additional COVID aid package, another $900 billion, which is more than the Pentagon gets in a year. And that was just to patch them through until additional aid could pass in the new administration. So, uh, you know, quite an amazing level of bipartisan cooperation. Should also point out at the end of December 2020, it was additional bipartisan legislation that extended beyond the COVID aid packages. It wasn't just a bipartisan agreement to continue the assistance to small businesses and to continue unemployment. The legislation also included a major energy package, regarded as the most significant climate legislation Congress has ever passed, a $35 billion package for clean energy, and including a ban on fluorohydrocarbons. There was also, in addition to that, finally a deal on the whole issue of surprise medical billing. An issue that they had been working on in Congress for a decade. They finally got the deal. This was all part of that December package. Got very little coverage. I'd say, in fact, all of these packages that passed over the course of 2020 got limited news coverage. I wonder what share of Americans who follow news closely were cognizant of the extent of bipartisan cooperation that occurred in 2020. It's quite remarkable.
That's a story, you're right, that we don't hear very much. You hear the story about the Hatfields and McCoys and how they're destroying America. You don't hear the story about them coming together. So let's jump ahead to Joe Biden is inaugurated. The first major thing he does is to pass a relief package, another $1.9 trillion. Not one single Republican vote for it. So this looks like you've got Democrats to control the White House, the House, and the Senate, and they are actually able to deliver on that majority status. So does this contradict the story you're telling?
No, I would say it doesn't contradict it. It is the American Rescue Plan is important legislation, but it is temporary legislation. It is very similar to the CARES Act. That in policy terms, it's not that large a departure from what had already been done on a bipartisan basis with all Republicans in agreement. Republicans were not providing that agreement here in 2021 because their view was the package was too large. A view that was shared, in fact, by Larry Summers. I mean, it was a legitimate position. To what extent is this degree of incomes and financial support for the economy needed in 2021? So there was disagreement, and Republicans approached the issue the same way they approached the stimulus package under Obama, which was to withhold support. Democrats proceed. I think they could have negotiated a much smaller package on bipartisan basis. So Democrats got what they wanted in the model was the legislation that had cleared the House under President Trump, but had not become law. HEROES Act that House Democrats had favored. So they had something ready to go and they were able to push it. I think now we move into the Democrats' agenda, which would be more similar to the Republican agenda of 2017. The wish list, the things that the party had wanted to do in an enduring way. The voting rights reform, reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act, and to restore elements of the Voting Rights Act that had been struck down by the Supreme Court. Major election reform package, which is HR 1. It's the House top priority in the House. They want to do a minimum wage increase. So this is more standard party politics, and I think you'll see Democrats struggling with internal disagreement on these matters. I'd also add police reform will be internally controversial for the party, and they will deal with some of the same internal fractures that Republicans had to struggle with in 2017.
So your message to progressives who are chomping at the bit to get their agenda is what?
Well, look what happened in 2017. You really think that the Democratic Party is substantially more unified internally than the Republican Party of 2017? Because the Republican Party of 2017 found itself unable to pass its wish list. So I think some realism here is needed about the challenges of legislating on party lines, and recognize how rarely it happens. Very little legislation passes with the support only of one party, even in the polarized Congress. So the Republicans basically got two big agenda items done on party line votes in 2017. They got their tax cuts, tax reform legislation, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, and they got to overturn the regulations that had been adopted late in the Obama administration. 13 different different regulations that were overturned under the Congressional Review Act. Those were the two. That's it. So they had unified control. They got two major enactments on party line votes. Everything else they did in that Congress with unified Republican control under President Trump had bipartisan support.
I think it's very interesting, and I would just say it pushes back against the assumption among many Democrats that Republicans unify. It's the Democrats who can't get their act together. And what you're showing is, no, actually, both parties struggle with the disagreements within the party. And someone like Senator Joe Manchin from West Virginia, he's not an exception. He's really the rule.
There are quite a few. I mean, there's a lot of focus on Manchin, I think because it is very helpful to Manchin to be out front on this. This is a state that voted overwhelmingly to reelect Trump, that if he had maintained some distance from the Democratic Party in a public way, that's useful to him. But I mean, I would point to that there were 8 Senate Democrats who voted against Bernie Sanders' amendment to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour. So it's not just Manchin. I think the focus on him is outsized.
Well, let me ask you about the urgency of now. Here in Minneapolis, we've had 2 African-American men who were killed by police. Just a day or so ago, we had a jury verdict against the police officer who killed George Floyd, 3 guilty decisions. And there is a palpable sense in Minnesota, and I think around the country, at least among those concerned about those issues, that Congress has to act. The urgency will force Congress to act. And we saw yesterday the president making a pitch for the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, which has already been passed by the House and is sitting over at the Senate. What would be your expectation about the passage of the George Floyd Act, given what I've described, that environment, but also what you know about Congress?
Well, as I said, it's just extraordinarily rare that you find you see legislation pass Congress and become law. Again, you get entered on the U.S. Code without bipartisan support. So, my baseline as you present this scenario, and as we consider these important issues, is that it's just extremely difficult, and rare for a party to do this alone. I think there is potential for bipartisanship if it's handled properly. Um, I mean, we had significant legislation, criminal justice reform under Trump, the First Step Act, that brought together liberal Democrats and conservative Republicans. Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina has indicated a desire to work on police reform. But can Democrats make the concessions that would be necessary to work with Republicans in a bipartisan manner on this? And will Republicans be prepared to give Democrats a win on this? It always takes two to tango. You can't just, you shouldn't blame the majority party for failures of bipartisanship when the minority party has a choice in the matter as well. But I think that there is some potential for bipartisanship here. I'm very doubtful that you will see legislation enacted on a party line vote. I think there would be a filibuster in the Senate, and my suspicion is that this issue is not important enough for senators that they're prepared to change the way the whole Senate operates just for this issue.
And I want to just say here that this is not your preference in terms of how policy turns out. You're an accomplished student and analyst of Congress. You're reporting on the facts, how things have played out over the last half century in Congress. And I recommend strongly, if you're interested in this, that you take a look at Professor Lee's book with Jim Curry, The Limits of Party Congress and the Lawmaking in a Polarized Era. Um, so let's pick up. You talked about the bipartisanship. It sounds promising and maybe surprising to a lot of people, but there's certainly limits to it. I mean, each party has got its red lines, right? That where there's not going to be bipartisanship.
That's right. So the way these bipartisan deals come together, which is still the norm for how legislation occurs, is that parties have their lists of things they must have for a deal to be worthwhile. If we don't get X or Y, then there's no point entering into this negotiation, or certainly not signing on to it. And then parties all both have a list of things they cannot accept. But there's a great deal between those two, that parties can get some of the key things that they need to have, as long as the other party doesn't cross the red line for the opposing party. And so you see these kind of log rolls come together where parties they trade off wins, and they often get rolled together in large omnibus packages that pass usually at a deadline. Congress has difficulty doing anything in advance of a deadline, the end of a Congress right before a recess. And then you get very little news coverage of what actually occurred. There'll be a story: Congress reaches a deal to keep the government open. And then the legislation will have lots of other stuff in there that will just not get any attention. So I think this is part of why the public sees Congress is not doing anything, that there's a failure of news coverage here, partly because of the tendency to massive omnibus packages. Congress doesn't legislate in the way that it used to. It used to be that you'd pass a lot of separate bills. Today, not very many individual laws get enacted, but they are huge, vast. Congress is not enacting less by way of pages of legislation today than it was in the 1990s, 1980s. In fact, it does more than it did in the 60s and 70s by that measure. But it does it in fewer individual pieces of legislation. So, but there's still a great deal that occurs and gets done, and yet it doesn't break through. I think there's a negativity bias also in news coverage, that when bipartisanship occurs, it means, oh, well, they've worked it out, it's fine. It's not interesting, like conflict is interesting, or news about things going wrong is interesting. And so there might be a story or two, and then it just disappears.
So let's get to why this is happening. What would explain why Speaker Ryan, very accomplished a politician, and Joe Biden, very experienced former senator and now president, why are they unable to move through their party's agenda?
Well, it's hard to get all members of your party on the same page. And majorities today are narrow. You know, Ryan's majority was slim. The majority that Democrats have to work with today is as narrow as is possible for a majority to be. That in the Senate, they must have the support of every Democrat to do something without any bipartisan support. So that's a high bar. That's difficult for leaders. Um, uh, the they may be misled by the ease with which the party can come together on symbolic matters. You can pass a bill out of the House if members know that it's really not going anywhere in the Senate. They won't scrutinize it in the same depth. It's because they realize it's really just laying down a marker. It's not legislating. So you can get agreement, let's say, around partisan initiatives, partisan priorities, under circumstances where it's sort of theoretical. It was very hard for Republicans to agree to pass lots of Obamacare repeal bills before they got their majority. But once they did, then suddenly you got to pay attention to the issues more closely, and you realize all the downsides of repeal for your constituents, for people you represent, becomes real. There's a lot of symbolic activity in a bicameral Congress, as particularly in national government that's frequently characterized by divided control. So it's easy to pass stuff that will be vetoed. So there's and it pleases the base. So you can give your base what they want as long as it is just a matter of symbolism. It's much harder, however, to do that when there are real world consequences.
So, for instance, the House of Representatives passed a bill relating to reparations. It's widely known that's not going anywhere in the Senate. It's something that progressives and others in the Democratic Party feel passionately about. So the House passes this. It sends a message to the party faithful that we hear you, but those voting for it in a very, very closely divided House, pretty confident, don't worry about it, it's not going anywhere.
Right, and it would be hard for the House to put together that majority if they were actually passing the bill.
So you've talked about the divisions within the party as a break, even when you have the majority, as Joe Biden does now. How about the nifty little system that James Madison put together, known as checks and balances? Does that play a role here?
Very much so. I mean, checks and balances are certainly alive and well in the polarized era. People are probably cognizant of the trends in Congress to increase frequency of party conflict. Many more votes break down on party lines, and the parties march together in lockstep on more votes. In the post-1980 period, but we're also talking about a period that 75% of the time has had Congress controlled by one party and a president controlled by the other. So you're not going to get legislation that only one party supports under circumstances of divided control, which is the normal state of affairs in American politics. A lot of the bargaining and negotiation that happens in Congress is because it's frankly forced on members and leaders. They don't enjoy it. It's unpleasant. It's unpleasant to have to settle for much less than what you want in many cases. And it's unpleasant not to be able to do the things that your constituents would really like to see you do, but that the other party disagrees with. But that's the normal state of affairs. Divided government is typical, and unified governments are rare and usually short-lived. I would be surprised if Democrats continue to hold on to unified control after the midterms, for example. That, just a loss of, small handful of seats. Well, you have to see how many seats are filled by the time we have the 2022 elections. But you would expect, based on American election history, that the party controlling the presidency will lose seats in Congress. That is the norm. It's just we call it, in fact, it's the midterm law. It's often referred to if you're teaching Intro to American Government. That's how you'll teach it. It's so typical. So that means that Democrats probably have only until 2022, and most legislation happens in year one rather than year two. So this is their shot.
Yeah, so we've got internal divisions within the party. There's a majority, but the majority has different factions. We've talked about the fact that you've got two different chambers, the House and the Senate. They're elected at different time points. They have different interests. Obviously, you've got the fact that you've got the legislative branch, but you've also got the president, who may have different agenda items. And you see some of that tension playing out right now with Joe Biden and particularly the progressives at this moment. Let's talk about another element. We've got a bunch of questions here about it. The filibuster, which is a rule in the Senate that requires 60 votes to move programmatic legislation. How much of a factor is that? Is this being overplayed by the media, or would it be on your top list of reasons that the majority can't get what it wants?
Well, I would say the top reason why majority party can't get what it wants is the frequency of divided government. That the filibuster is not particularly important for forcing bipartisan compromise under conditions of divided government, because legislation is going to have support from both parties to become law under those conditions. So the filibuster really only comes into play with teeth under conditions of unified government, where the filibuster allows the minority party to block an agenda item that the majority cares about. So Jim and I took stock of that in our book, in our study, to look at when majority parties fail on their agendas. Why do they fail? And how important is the filibuster as a cause of failure? We find that about a third of majority party failures in unified government can be traced to the difficulty of clearing the 60 vote threshold in the Senate. So it's important. But more failures occurred because of internal divisions within the majority party, 2/3, in fact, of the failures in unified government stemmed from the inability of the majority party to coalesce. So there's a tendency, I think, to underrate that second limit on parties. Parties, in fact, want to hide that from their supporters. They don't. It's much easier to blame the opposing party. They don't want to say, we can't get our people all together on this, on the same page. The filibuster gives them an out in many cases. They'll say, we can't do this because of the problem of the filibuster. So they hype the filibuster as an obstacle because it's a very nice way to pass the buck to the opposing party.
Is Mitch McConnell getting a raw deal? There are a bunch of questions here asking about Mitch McConnell's blatant abuse of the filibuster, and how he's the real roadblock.
We couldn't find evidence of differential behavior on the part of Democrats when they are in the minority and Republicans when they are in the minority in general, in the use of the filibuster. So
if the filibuster was eliminated, it sounds like you're saying you wouldn't expect a kind of transformation in the productivity of Congress when there's unified government.
No, I wouldn't. There would be some wins that Democrats right now would have a better chance of getting than they currently do. I don't think there's anything in the bag. Like if we looked at the list, that we just considered here, what Democrats would like to do in 2021, I'm not totally confident that the party is so unified that it would be able to do it in the absence of a filibuster. Election reform, HR1, there are a lot of Democrats with doubts about that package. Passes the House because it's easy to pass it knowing that it's still going to have to get through the gauntlet of the Senate. Minimum wage increase, there's a lot of disagreement within the party about how high to go. I think you could get a bipartisan deal on, say, a $10 or an $11 minimum wage, but that won't satisfy the, the Democratic left, the progressives in the party. That they will see that as a failure. But what will Democrats be able to do in the absence of the filibuster on the minimum wage? They could probably raise it, but I think Manchin isn't prepared to go above $12.
Right.
So in other words, the difference between, so you abolish the filibuster for a $12 minimum wage when you can get a $10 minimum wage on a bipartisan deal, is hard for me to believe that that Senate Democrats would take that trade.
So let me move on. We've got a bunch of questions here, which I'm filtering in. One of the most remarkable themes in your book is how little things have changed. The word continuity is used often to describe the last half century in terms of congressional activity. It's staggering when you consider that we have political parties that are much more unified. The conservative Democrats are gone for the most part. It's much more of a liberal party. The Republicans are much more conservative than even the unity among Democrats. You've got a party nomination system that polices that. You've got a change in the operations within Congress to reinforce the power of leaders so they can really drive policy. And yet, continuity, it's almost unbelievable.
That's right. That was the reaction that Jim and I had when we started work on this research. We knew that the way Congress operated had changed dramatically. We knew that there was much more partisan conflict, that the parties were much more internally unified. We knew that the leaders play a much more prominent role in negotiating policy in the contemporary Congress. We knew that regular order was rarely observed, meaning that when they engage in legislating, it's much more centralized in top leaders. The leaders more or less put it together, and that committee chairs do not have as much by way of independent influence. So we knew all this. We're legislative scholars. We knew about all these internal changes in how Congress operated. We certainly don't contest the proposition that American politics is highly polarized. So our question in that was, what difference is this making for lawmaking, for the laws that pass? And here's where we begin to find these continuities. We were very surprised to find so little effect on enacting coalitions. Even as Congress has become so much more polarized in roll call voting generally, if you just look at the votes that result in the enactment of laws, there hasn't been any increase in partisanship in Congress at all.
So I'm really struck. If you look at polling, you see that there's substantial majorities of Americans saying they want both parties to compromise. And what you're describing is something much more like that than I think is commonly assumed. Are Americans getting more of what they want than maybe they know?
They're getting more of what they want than they know. Yes, I think that's a fair summary. And so there's a misunderstanding, I think, between Congress as an institution and our national government and the American public, that they want to see bipartisanship. Well, that is how Congress predominantly legislates. It's rare for Congress to legislate any other way. And Congress does a lot. I mean, we just discussed the pandemic aid in 2020, but it wasn't only pandemic aid. The Congress also had major policy breakthroughs in 2020. I can list for you a series of other major policy breakthroughs on a bipartisan basis through the Trump presidency, which I'm not sure any of that broke through. I mean, to a public, continually engaged with the latest controversy, the latest scandal, the latest outrage, and so little attention to what was happening on the lawmaking front.
So here's a question from one of our friends in the audience. When a law passes that both parties support, are news reporters lazy in not reporting this? Or is it that they only like the train wrecks and the conflict?
I don't think it's laziness. I think it's that the concern is that this is boring, that it won't attract an audience, there won't be interest in the legislation. And so, so it'll get covered in the trade press in the affected policy area. So, for example, in 2015, there was major legislation on Toxic Substances Control Act, which created a new division in the EPA with its own dedicated funding stream regulating toxic substances. So this was a long result of a long negotiation between Republicans and Democrats. This happened in divided government under Obama on environment. This is a significant new set of regulations imposed with a division dedicated to it, and one that would be funded. It continued to be implemented under President Trump. Trump didn't attempt to undercut the implementation of this new law. It's the most significant expansion of the EPA's authority in 40 years, and no attention. I looked for news coverage of it. Nothing on the nightly news. No front page stories on this breakthrough because it was bipartisan. Boxer and Inhofe had worked it out, so it gets covered to the extent that it's covered at all in publications read by the industry. Even though industry and environmentalists signed off on it. I mean, this had the support of both parties, and including environmentalist members.
So listening to you, and particularly about the compromise and the frustration of majority party leaders where the government is controlled by one party, it makes me wonder, what are members of Congress and leadership all about? They're clearly not able to pass a lot of their core policy preferences, the commitments that they've promised to their base. What are they doing? What is this about?
Well, parties are enmeshed in a competition for power, for offices, for control of government. The party that wins the majority in the House of Representatives gets to chair all the committees. Even if they win a majority by one vote, they will chair all the committees and therefore have the agenda setting power in every standing committee in Congress. Same is true in the Senate side. So there's a lot at stake. They need to excite voters to care about who wins elections. They need to tell them, this is what we would do. This is why the other side is doing a bad job. So there's lots of party messaging aimed at winning elections, at winning power, at showing up the other guys for what they're doing wrong, and in trying to make the case for yourself, for your own side. But it's electioneering. And we need to be clear that electioneering is different from lawmaking. It's it's easier to work out a slogan that members of a party can support than it is to get them to hash out the legislative details to enact a law. So
this is just a bit mind-boggling. You've got parties that are more ideologically apart than we've seen in maybe since the Civil War. We've got leaders who are telling their supporters messages that are ideologically extreme in many cases. And yet they're reaching these compromises. And your book shows that often the leaders, the people who put together these compromises, don't want to brag about it. In fact, they feel pretty down about it.
Mhm.
It's maybe that's the biggest change in the last half century, that deal making and credit taking and so-called bringing home the bacon is less important than taking a stand for the base that is, as you said, symbolic and about holding on to power.
Yes, yes. It is interesting to see how little effort the parties make to take credit for what they pass. Um, when they pass it on a bipartisan basis. Um, reflecting back on 2020, I mean, the CARES Act is amazing, and yet I mean, who's taking credit for it? Anybody? Um, it's like it's the whole thing is forgotten. And forgotten even by the people who were responsible for putting it together. It's consistent, as you point out, Larry, with the findings in our book. We looked at what members have to say about legislation that successfully passes Congress. And we looked at it over time. We looked at the quotes that members give in news coverage of past legislation, see what they say, and they're very negative uh, uh, on it. So those who didn't vote for it criticize it, but even those who supported it often will say, "Well, this is the best we could do." That's not an unusual message that they'll give a quote along those lines that we did what we could, but it's not the kind of thing to fire up the troops. You need good messaging for that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Carol Buffton's got a question for us. She asked, okay, so what's the point of parties winning power if policy can't be enacted?
It's a legitimate question. Um, I mean, they fight for what they say they're going to fight for. So parties are not misleading you. They do. So the Democratic Party does stand for a different set of priorities and principles than the Republican Party. So you can depend on them to push to fight for the things they say that they're going to try to do. But don't assume that they're going to succeed, even if they have a majority, because even if the general um, tenor of the party, wants to support X or Y, it doesn't mean you'll be able to get the universal agreement that will be necessary to do it. That there will be some holdouts in the party, and so you probably are not going to bring those folks along unless they have bipartisan cover. These are the folks. Not very many members of Congress represent swing districts, but the majority party always has to have a contingent of them in order to have a majority. And so those folks are cross-pressured, and they don't really want to support legislation unless they are able to say that Republicans support it also if they're Democrats, or Democrats support it also if they're Republicans. That's what they want. They want not to be seen as a member of the national party predominantly. There's not a lot of such members, but it's always enough, it seems, to create problems for the leadership. Uh, so that it definitely creates a gap between what parties say in elections and what they're able to do after the elections.
And it's interesting to think about the Democratic and particularly Republican Party base of supporters. Those who are most loyal and engaged. There's palpable frustration, and I think you see it certainly with Donald Trump, who basically said, "I'm going to blow up the system and drain the title pools in DC." And I think part of your analysis helps to explain it. At one point, you talk about this constant disappointment that the partisans are feeling for half measures. And you quote a longtime staffer to a member of Congress who says that the parties seem to be enmeshed in endless cycles of overpromising and under-delivering. And given that, maybe it's not a surprise that so many Democrats and Republicans are in this rage about why their party is not delivering, why they're not listening to them.
Mhm. I mean, when the parties enmeshed in this close competition for control use this strident rhetoric that's become normal in American politics about the evils of the other side, and all the things that we would do if you just give us if you just vote for us and put us in there. And then when they're not able to do it, that's the norm. Then it's no wonder that the cynicism increases, and that the public loses trust. And I suspect it's one of the factors driving down the approval of national leaders in American politics. That presidents normally hover right around 50% approval. It's not unusual for them to go below it, and they are at the top. Congressional leaders' approval ratings are usually around 25%. So they're not popular because their strongest supporters are continually feeling let down. Let's rewind, to the passage of the Affordable Care Act. We can reflect now on the importance of that legislation for our party politics afterwards. Under Obama, the universal, the step towards universal health care coverage under Obama. At the time it was passed, Democrats, the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, was very disappointed in the legislation. They saw it as a sellout for pharmaceutical companies. Didn't see the assistance to people to buy health insurance as nearly sufficient. So they found that when they went out to campaign in the 2010 elections, that they couldn't even take credit for the Affordable Care Act. So imagine what leaders confront with routine legislation has a lesser landmark status. So they don't talk a lot about what they were able to do. There's not a lot of explanation of what Congress does. Instead, they just focus on the partisan red meat that can excite the voters. But later on, when it comes time to deliver, they are not able to do so in a way that the base feels vindicated by.
Doug Hartman, who's chair of the sociology department at the University of Minnesota, has got a question. How about court confirmations or other types of action rather than policy legislation?
Mm-hmm. Yes, there has been a change in how confirmations work in the Senate. That the executive items on the so-called executive calendar, meaning executive branch nominations as well as judicial nominations, used to be subject to the filibuster. The Democrats in 2013 went nuclear. They used a procedural mechanism to allow a simple majority to confirm executive branch and judicial appointees below the Supreme Court. And then under President Trump, in order to get Neil Gorsuch confirmed to the Supreme Court, Republicans went nuclear to allow simple majority in the Senate to confirm Supreme Court justices. And so that has had the effect of allowing more confirmations to proceed on party line votes than had been the case. But if we take a wider view of nominations, looking back over the decades, used to be that there were just not very many roll call votes on nominations at all. Presidents largely got who they wanted into those positions, and there wasn't a lot of party conflict about it. As party conflict rose, but the filibuster was in place, it became more difficult to get confirmations done. And so you began to see longer delays in confirming both executive branch and judicial nominees. So that going nuclear in some ways returned back to an old status quo ante, where presidents were basically getting who they wanted, even under conditions of divided government. It was just less politicized. So that yes, we do see people getting appointed to cabinet cabinet positions, and people appointed to the Supreme Court who have no cross-party support today, and that is new.
So you've described a system where Americans who want compromise are getting more compromise than they appreciate because of bipartisanship. You've also described a system that is understandably infuriating the progressives in the Democratic Party and the conservatives in the Republican Party, who are being overpromised with pretty much confidence among the leadership that they're not going to be able to deliver. So Are there reforms that you think should be done, and for which problem?
That's a tough question. As I reflect on an American politics that's as evenly divided as ours is, where neither party really commands the trust of the American people. A party has to win an election. It's a two-party system. Someone has to win. Um, but the short-lived nature of unified government, I think, reflects that lack of trust in any one party to hold the reins of power in the system. It's basically a 50-50 country. So I think a system of checks and balances that basically forces negotiation between the parties virtually at all times is well suited to a 50-50 country. If there were a set of circumstances where a small minority were empowered by American institutions to block what a large majority of Americans wanted, I think there would be more, I would have more confidence in recommending major reform to reduce the checks in the system. But I'm reluctant to do so under conditions like we are currently presented with.
But let me ask you about that, because I look at the system and there's some things that alarm me. Um, there used to be a conversation about budget deficits, and both parties, for their own reasons, no longer really talk about it. Um, at some point, America could be in a difficult spot, and the lack of any conversation about it of a serious nature within the halls of government, to me, is a concern. We've got a security challenge with China, which our national security agencies are identifying as our number one threat. And if there's a coherent response to that, that's including Congress, that's eluded me to this point. We've got deep racial divides with regards to policing and voting. And as we've talked about, that's going to be a red line for Republicans. So there seems to be, that and climate change, there's a long list of big problems. And Congress seems to be just stalemated on at least those issues. On other areas, they're able to, find bipartisan, watered down solutions.
I wouldn't say that they're always watered down solutions, but they largely find when solutions are found, they are bipartisan. It's just about
But
impossible to pass legislation
but
any
those
other way.
those those issues I'm talking about, budget deficits, racial disparities in voting and policing, the China. I mean, these are massive problems.
Yeah,
And does it
immigration
worry
too.
you that this system is not working? That there are reforms that could help it work better?
There there are big problems that need to be addressed, but addressing them without cross-party support in a political system where no party seems to be able to maintain power for very long is not a recipe for a lasting answer. Like imagine the issue of climate change. I mean, if the U.S. is going to decarbonize the economy, that's a decade-long, multi-decade-long proposition. Well, to pass something without any cross-party support here in 2021, and then the 2022 elections, and there's a backlash swing like normally happens in midterms, what's the likelihood that any big blueprint that might be hashed out now will continue to go forward? That if you can't get a deal, then it's hard to implement and carry forward any solution that you might come up with, as good as it might look on paper. If there isn't cross-party support that can sustain beyond the next elections, then it really isn't an answer.
So I guess
So I'd say that there's no shortcut for activists who want to see progress on any of those issues. They have to get cross-party buy-in. You can't do this simply within one party. I
that's
mean,
great.
unless we have a major realignment of voters in American politics, where one party then becomes dominant, so that you can expect that party to hold on to power for, multiple elections, one after another, and can consolidate policies adopted by that party.
So maybe
But we haven't seen that.
So maybe the take-home message is that if you are passionate about seeing change, you need to enter into a conversation with folks you don't necessarily agree with, and find areas where you can carve out policies. I don't know
That's
about
how they
you.
do it in Congress, in fact.
Yeah,
Like
I'm just not.
the energy bill in 2020, they don't talk about climate change, but they did they did things that were necessary to make for more clean energy, and they did things to address global warming. You just have to do it in a way that's sensitive to disagreements between the parties, and so it can be done even on environment, which is a major flashpoint between the parties.
Yeah, I think the George Floyd bill, the John Lewis bill, the issues around the deficit and rising debt. I'd like to see action on those things, but in various ways that cross red lines. Professor Lee, this has been fascinating. I think you really kind of opened people's eyes to the reality of Congress.